Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we continue our reading of Red Planet by Robert Heinlein. Our heroes, Jim and Frank, have skated hundreds of miles down a Martian canal, almost died in the desert, been rescued by Martians, taken to the Martian city, and now find themselves right back where they started from. Chapter 8: The Other World. Jim set up housekeeping, or hospital keeping, in the smallest room that Gecko could find for him. There had been a growing together immediately after their arrival. On its conclusion, Jim had found, as before, that his command of the dominant tongue had improved. He had made Gecko understand that Frank was sick and needed quiet. Gecko offered to take over Frank's care, but Jim refused. Martian therapy might cure Frank, or it might kill him. He asked instead for a plentiful supply of drinking water. His right, now that he was a water friend, almost a tribal brother, and he asked for the colorful Martian silks that had been used by the boys in place of resting frames. From these silks, Jim made a soft bed for Frank and a nest nearby for himself and Willis. He bedded Frank down, roused him enough to get him to drink deeply of water, and then waited for his friend to get well. The room was quite comfortably warm. Jim took off his outdoor suit, stretched and scratched. On second thought, he peeled off Frank's elastic suit as well and covered him with a layer of flame-colored cloth. After that, he dug into Frank's travel bag and looked over the food supply. Up to now, he'd been too busy and too tired to worry about his stomach. Now the very sight of the labels made him drool. He picked out a can of synthetic orange juice, vitamin fortified, and a can of simulated chicken fillet. The latter had started life in a yeast tank at North Colony, but Jim was used to yeast protein, and the flavor was every bit as tempting as white breast of chicken. Whistling, he got out his knife and got busy. Willis had wandered off somewhere, but he did not miss him. Subconsciously, he was not disposed to worry about Willis while they were both in a native city. The place was filled with an atmosphere of peace and security. In fact, Jim hardly thought about his patient until he had finished and wiped his mouth. Frank was still sleeping, but his breathing was noisy and his face still flushed. The air in the room, though warm and of satisfactory pressure, was Mars dry. Jim got a handkerchief from his bag, wet it, and put it over Frank's face. From time to time, he moistened it again. Later, he got another handkerchief, doused it, and tied it around his own face. Gecko came in with Willis tagging along. "Jim Marlowe," he stated, and settled himself. "Gecko," Jim answered, and went on with moistening Frank's face cloth. The Martian remained quiet so long that Jim decided he must have retreated into his other world. But when Jim looked at him, Gecko's eyes showed lively, alert interest. After a long wait, he asked Jim what he was doing and why. Jim tried to explain that his kind must breathe water as well as air, but his Martian vocabulary, despite the growing together, was not up to the strain it placed upon it. He gave up, and there was another long silence. Eventually, the Martian left, Willis with him. Presently, Jim noticed that the face cloths, both his and Frank's, were not drying out rapidly. Shortly, they were hardly drying at all. He took off his, as it made him uncomfortable, and decided that it must be uncomfortable for Frank as well. He stopped using them entirely. Gecko returned. After only 10 minutes of silence, he spoke, showing thereby almost frantic haste for his kind. He wanted to know if the water that flies with the air was now sufficient. Jim assured him that it was and thanked him. After 20 minutes or so of silence, Gecko again left. Jim decided to go to bed. It had been a long, hard day, and the previous night could hardly be called a night of rest. He looked around for some way to switch off the light, but could find none. Giving up, he lay down, pulled up a polychrome sheet to his chin, and went to sleep. "Hey, Jim, wake up!" Blearily, Jim opened his eyes and closed them again. "Go away. Come on, snap out of it. I've been awake the past 2 hours while you snored. I want to know some things." "What do you want to know? Say, how do you feel?" "Me?" said Frank. "I feel fine. Why shouldn't I? Where are we?" Jim looked him over. Frank's color was certainly better, and his voice sounded normal, the hoarseness all gone. "You were plenty sick yesterday," he informed him. "I think you were out of your head." Frank wrinkled his forehead. "Maybe I was. I've sure had the darndest dreams. There was a crazy one about a desert cabbage. That was no dream. What? I said that was no dream, the desert cabbage, nor any of the rest of it. Do you know where we are? That's what I was going to ask you. We're in Cinia. That's where we are. In Cinia? Jim tried to give Frank a coherent account of the preceding 2 days. He was somewhat hampered by the item of their sudden translation from far up the canal back to Cinia, because he did not understand it clearly himself. I figure it's sort of a subway paralleling the canal, a subway like you read about. Martians don't do that sort of engineering. Martians built the canals. Yeah, but that was a long, long time ago. Maybe they built the subway a long, long time ago. What do you know about it? Well, nothing, I guess. Never mind, I'm hungry. Anything left to eat? Sure. Jim got up and looked around. Willis was still missing. I'd like to find Gecko and ask him where Willis is, he fretted. Nuts, said Frank. Let's eat breakfast. Well, all right. Once the meal was over, Frank opened the larger question. Okay, so we're in Cinia. We've still got to get home and fast. The question is, how do we go about it? Now, as I see it, if these Martians could bring us back here so fast, they can turn around and put us back where they found us, and then we can head home up the east leg of Strymon. How does that strike you? Sounds all right, I guess, Jim answered. But then the first thing to do is to find Gecko and try to arrange it without fiddling around. The first thing to do, Jim contradicted, is to find Willis. But why? Hasn't he caused enough trouble? Leave him. He's happy here. Frank, you take entirely the wrong attitude toward Willis. Didn't he get us out of a jam? If it hadn't been for Willis, you'd be coughing your lungs out in the desert. If it hadn't been for Willis, we wouldn't have been in the desert in the first place. No, that's not fair. The truth is, skip it, skip it. Okay, go find Willis. Jim left Frank to clean up the litter of breakfast and set out. Although he was never after able to give a fully coherent account of just what happened to him on this errand, certain gross facts are clear. He started by looking for Gecko, asking for him of the first Martian he met in the corridors by the barbarous expedient of voicing the general inquiry followed by Gecko's name. Jim was not, and probably never would be, a competent linguist, but his attempt worked. The first Martian he encountered took him to another, as an earthly citizen might lead a foreigner to a policeman. This Martian took him to Gecko. Jim had no great trouble in explaining to Gecko that he wanted Willis returned to him. Gecko listened, then explained gently that what Jim wanted was impossible. Jim started over again, sure that his own poor command of the language had caused miscommunication. Gecko let him finish, then made it quite clear that he understood correctly what it was that Jim wanted, but that Jim could not have it, could not have Willis. No, Gecko was sorrowful to have to refuse his friend with whom he had shared the pure water of life, but this thing could not be. Under the direct influence of Gecko's powerful personality, Jim understood most of what was said and guessed the rest. Gecko's refusal was unmistakable. It is not important that Jim did not have his gun with him. Gecko could not inspire the hatred in him that Howe did. For one thing, Gecko's warm sympathy poured out of him in a flood. Nevertheless, Jim was thunderstruck, indignant, and quite unable to accept the verdict. He stared up at the Martian for a long moment. Then he walked away abruptly, not choosing his direction and shouting for Willis as he did so. Willis! Oh, Willis! Here, Willis! Willis, boy, come to Jim! The Martians started after him, each stride 3 of Jim's. Jim ran, still shouting. He turned a corner, came face to face with 3 natives, and darted between their legs and beyond. Gecko got into a traffic jam with them, which required time-wasting exercise of Martian protocol to straighten out. Jim got considerably ahead. He stuck his head into every archway he came to and shouted. One such led into a chamber occupied by Martians frozen in that trance-like state they call visiting the other world. Jim would no more have disturbed a Martian in that trance ordinarily than an American Western frontier child would have teased a grizzly, but he was in no shape to care or notice. He shouted in there too, thereby causing an unheard of and unthinkable disturbance. The least response was violent trembling. One poor creature was so disturbed that he lifted abruptly all of his legs and fell to the floor. Jim did not notice. He was already gone, shouting into the next chamber. Gecko caught up with him and scooped him up with 2 great hand flaps. Jim Marlowe, he said. Jim Marlowe, my friend. Jim sobbed and beat on the Martian's hard thorax with both his fists. Gecko endured it for a moment, then wrapped a third palm flap around Jim's arms, securing him. Jim looked wildly up at him. Willis, he said in his own language. I want Willis. You've got no right. Gecko cradled him and answered softly, I have no power. This is beyond me. We must go to the other world. He moved away. Jim made no answer, tired by his own outburst. Gecko took a ramp downward, then another and another. Down and down he went, much deeper than Jim had ever been before, deeper perhaps than any terrestrial had ever been. On the upper levels, they passed other Martians. Farther down, there were none. At last, Gecko halted in a small chamber far underground. It was exceptional in that it was totally without decoration. Its plain pearl gray walls seemed almost un-Martian. Gecko laid Jim on the floor here and said, This is the gate to the other world. Jim picked himself up. Huh? He said. What do you mean? And then carefully rephrased the question in the dominant tongue. He need not have bothered. Gecko did not hear him. Jim craned his neck and looked up. Gecko stood utterly motionless, all legs firmly planted, his eyes open but lifeless. Gecko had crossed over into the other world. For the love of Mike, Jim fretted, he sure picks a sweet time to pull a stunt like that. He wondered what he ought to do, try to find his way to the upper levels alone or wait for Gecko. Natives were reputed to be able to hold a trance for weeks at a time, but Doc McRae had pooh-poohed such stories. He decided to wait for a while at least and sat down on the floor, hands clasped around his knees. He felt considerably calmed down and in no special hurry, as if Gecko's boundless calm had flowed over into him while the native had carried him. After a while, an indefinitely long while, the room grew darker. Jim was not disturbed. He was vastly content, feeling again the untroubled happiness he had known in his two experiences of growing together. A tiny light appeared at great distance in the darkness and grew, but it did not illuminate the small pearl gray room. It built up an outdoor scene instead. It was as if a stereo movie projector was being used to project Hollywood's best work in full natural color. That it was not an importation from Earth, Jim knew, for the scene, while utterly realistic, had no slick commercial finish, no plot. He seemed to be seeing a grove of canal plants from a viewpoint about a foot off the ground. The viewpoint shifted steadily and erratically as if the camera was being trucked on a very low dolly here and there through the stalks of the canal plants. The viewpoint would shift quickly for a few feet, stop, then change direction and move again, but it never got very far off the ground. Sometimes it would wheel in a full circle, a panorama of 360 degrees. It was during one of these full rotations that he caught sight of a water seeker. It would not have been strange if he had not recognized it as such, for it was enormously magnified. As it charged in, it filled the entire screen, but it was impossible not to recognize those curving scimitar claws, the grisly horror of the gaping sucker orifice, those pounding legs, and most particularly the stomach clutching revulsion the thing inspired. Jim could almost smell it. The viewpoint from which he saw it did not change. It was frozen to one spot, with the foul horror rushing directly at him in the final death charge. At the last possible instant, when the thing filled the screen, something happened. The face, or where the face should have been, disappeared, went to pieces, and the creature collapsed in a blasted ruin. The picture was wiped out completely for a few moments, replaced by whirling colored turmoil. Then a light, sweet voice said, Well, aren't you a cute little fella? The picture built up again as if a curtain had been lifted, and Jim stared at another face, almost as grotesque as the faceless horror it replaced. Although this face occupied the whole screen and was weirdly distorted, Jim had no trouble in placing it as a colonial's respirator mask. What startled him almost out of the personal unawareness with which he was accepting this shadow show was that he recognized the mask. It was decorated with the very tiger stripes that Smythe had painted over for a quarter credit. It was his own, as it used to be. He heard his own voice say, You're too little to be wandering around by yourself. Another one of those vermin might really get you. I think I'll take you home. The scene went swinging through the canal growth at a greater height, bobbling up and down to the boys' steps. Presently, the point of view came out into open country and showed in the distance the star-shaped layout and bubble domes of South Colony. Jim adjusted to the idea of watching himself, hearing himself, and accepted the notion of seeing things from Willis's viewpoint. The record was quite unedited. It pushed forward in a straight line complete recollection of everything Willis had seen and heard from the time Jim had first taken him under his protection. Willis's visual recollections were not entirely accurate. They seemed to be affected by his understanding of what he saw and how used to it he was. Jim, the Jim in the shadow show, at first seemed to have 3 legs. It was some time before the imaginary excrescence vanished. Other actors, Jim's mother, old Doc McRae, Frank, developed from formless shapes to full, though somewhat distorted, representations. On the other hand, every sound was heard with great clarity and complete accuracy. As Jim listened and watched, he found that he savored sounds of every sort, and most especially voices, with a new and rich delight. Most especially, he enjoyed seeing himself as Willis saw him. With affection and warm humor, he saw himself stripped of dignity, but clothed in a lively regard. He was loved, but not respected. He, Jim himself, was a great bumbling servant, helpful but maddeningly unreliable in his attentions, like a poorly trained dog. As for other human beings, they were curious creatures, harmless on the whole, but unpredictable traffic hazards. This bouncer eye view of people amused Jim mightily. Day by day and week by week, the account unfolded, even to the periods of dark and quiet when Willis chose to sleep or was shut up. It carried on to Syrtis Minor and into a bad time when Jim was missing. Howe appeared as a despised voice in a pair of legs. Beecher was a faceless nonentity. It continued step by step, and somehow Jim was neither tired nor bored. He was simply in the continuity and could no more escape from it than could Willis, nor did it occur to him to try. At last it wound up in the Martian city of Cinia and ended in a period of dark and quiet. Jim stretched his cramped legs. The light was returning. He looked about, but Gecko was still deep in his trance. He looked back and found that a door had opened in what had appeared to be a blank wall. He looked through and into a room beyond, decorated as Martian rooms so frequently are, in careful imitation of an outdoor scene. Lush countryside, more like the sea bottoms south of Cinia than like the desert. A Martian was in the room. Jim was never afterward able to visualize him completely, for his face, and particularly his eyes, compelled attention. An Earthling has no good way to estimate the age of a Martian, yet Jim had the unmistakable impression that this Martian was very old, older than his father, older even than Doc McRae. Jim Marlowe, the native said in clear tones. Welcome, Jim Marlowe, friend of my people and friend of mine. I give you water. He spoke in basic English, in an accent vaguely familiar. Jim had never heard a Martian speak an earthly tongue before, but he knew that some of them did speak basic. It was a relief to be able to answer in his own speech. I drink with you. May you ever enjoy pure and plentiful water. I thank you, Jim Marlowe. No actual water was used, and none was needed. There followed a polite period of quiet, during which Jim thought about the Martian's accent. It was oddly familiar. It put him in mind of his father's voice. Again, it sounded like Doc McRae. You are troubled, Jim Marlowe. Your unhappiness is ours. How may I help you? I don't want anything, Jim answered, except to go home and take Willis with me. They took Willis away. They shouldn't have done that. The silence that followed was even longer than before. At last the Martian answered, when one stands on the ground, one may not see over the horizon. Yet Phobos sees all horizons. He hesitated a moment before the word Phobos. As if in afterthought, he added, Jim Marlowe, I have but lately learned your tongue. Forgive me if I stumble. Oh, you speak it beautifully, Jim said quite sincerely. The words I know. The pictures are not clear. Tell me, Jim Marlowe, what is the London Zoo? Jim had to ask him to repeat it before he was clear the Martian had asked about the London Zoo. Jim tried to explain, but broke off before he had finished elaborating the idea. The Martian radiated such cold, implacable anger that Jim was frightened. After a time, the Martian's mood changed abruptly, and Jim was again bathed in a warm glow of friendliness that poured out of his host like rays from the sun and was as real as the sunshine to Jim. Jim Marlowe, twice you have saved the little one whom you call Willis from. He used first a Martian term Jim did not know, then changed it to water seekers. Have you killed many such? Quite a few, I guess, Jim answered, then added, I kill 'em whenever I see 'em. They're getting too smart to hang around the colonies much. The Martian appeared to be thinking this over, but when he got around to answering, he had again changed the subject. Jim Marlowe, twice, perhaps three times, you have saved the little one. Once, perhaps twice, our little one has saved you. Each time you have grown closer together. Day by day, you have grown closer until neither of you is complete without the other. Do not leave here, Jim Marlowe. Stay. You are welcome in my house, a son and a friend. Jim shook his head. I have to go home. In fact, I have to go home right away. It's a mighty kind offer, and I want to thank you, but he explained as clearly as he could the threat to the welfare of the colony and the urgent need for him to carry the message. If you please, sir, my friend and I, would like to be taken back to where Kombuch found us. Only I want Willis to before we go. You wish to go back to the city where you were found? You do not wish to go home? Jim explained that Frank and he would go home from there. Now, sir, why don't you ask Willis whether or not he wants to stay or go home with me? The old Martian sighed, exactly as Jim's father had been known to sigh after a fruitless family discussion. There is a law of life and a law of death, and both are the law of change. Even the hardest rock is worn away by the wind. You understand, my son and friend, that even if the one you call Willis returns with you, there will come a time when the little one must leave you? Oh, yes, I guess so. You mean Willis can come home with me? We will speak to the one you call Willis. The old one spoke to Gecko, who stirred and muttered in his sleep. Then the three of them wound back up the ramps, with Gecko carrying Jim and the old one following a little behind. They stopped in a chamber about halfway up the surface. The room was dark when they reached it, but it became illuminated as soon as the party entered. Jim saw the place was lined, floor to ceiling, with little niches, and each niche contained a bouncer, as similar each to the other as identical twins. The little fellows raised their eye stalks when the light came on and peered interestedly around. From somewhere in the room came a shout of, Hi, Jim boy! Jim looked around but could not pick out the bouncer that had spoken. Before he could do anything about it, the phrase had echoed around the room, Hi, Jim boy! Hi, Jim boy! Hi, Jim boy! Each time in Jim's own voice, as borrowed by Willis. Jim turned back to Gecko in bewilderment. Which one is Willis? He demanded, forgetting to speak in the dominant tongue. The chorus started up again. Which one is Willis? Which one is Willis? Which one is which one, which one, Willis, Willis? Jim stepped out into the middle of the room. Willis, he commanded, come to Jim. Off to his right, a bouncer popped out from a middle tier, landed on the floor, and waddled up to him. Pick up Willis, it demanded. Gratefully, Jim did so. Where Jim boy been? Willis wanted to know. Jim scratched the bouncer. You wouldn't understand if I told you. Look, Willis, Jim is about to go home. Does Willis want to go home with him? Jim, go? Willis said doubtfully, as if the unrelenting echoing chorus had made it hard for him to understand. Jim, go home right away. Is Willis coming, or is Willis going to stay here? Jim, go, Willis, go, the bouncer announced, stating it as a law of nature. Okay, tell Gecko that. Why? Willis asked suspiciously. Tell Gecko that, or you'll get left behind. Go on, tell him. Okay. Willis addressed Gecko in a series of clucks and croaks. Neither the old Martian nor Gecko made any comment. Gecko picked up the two smaller creatures, and the procession continued up toward the surface. Gecko put them down outside the room assigned to Frank and Jim carried Willis inside. and we will follow how they fare with the Martians next time.